My sister yanked the IV line straight out of my arm while our mother stood by the window sipping an iced matcha latte and watching the blood pool on my pristine white sheets. Brittany smirked, absolutely certain that no one would ever believe a word I said. Then the heavy wooden door of my room swung open. Nurse Brenda stood in the doorway, her eyes blazing with fury as she looked at us. "I saw everything," she stated, her voice booming. "And the digital security footage has already been saved to the hospital cloud. My name is Clara, and I am 33 years old. Until that very morning, I had spent my entire life letting my family treat me like a disposable stepping stone. But lying in that hospital bed, watching the color drain completely from my sister's face, I realized the rules of the game had finally changed. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled my toxic family's entire fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own fortress after your family tried to leave you out in the cold. I had collapsed 2 days prior. I was working 80-hour weeks, pushing my body to its absolute limits to close a massive merger. Of course, my family thought I was just doing data entry for some faceless corporation. They had no idea I was actually the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of a medical artificial intelligence firm currently valued at over $800 million. They just thought I was the same plain, quiet, and easily manipulated scapegoat they had always known. When I finally blinked my eyes open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the Chicago General Hospital VIP suite blinded me for a moment. My body felt incredibly heavy. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room until my sister's sharp voice cut through the fog. "Are you finally awake, or are you just faking it to get out of work again?" Brittany snapped. I turned my head. Brittany stood right beside my bed, wearing a designer dress that cost more than my supposed monthly salary. Our mother Diane was leaning against the large picture window, completely ignoring the fact that her youngest daughter had just spent 48 hours unconscious. She simply stirred her iced matcha and looked at her phone. Without asking how I felt, without a single word of concern, Brittany slammed a thick stack of legal documents right onto my chest. "Sign it," she demanded, shoving a premium silver pen into my uninjured hand. I blinked, trying to clear the lingering dizziness. "What is this?" I asked, my voice raspy and dry. "It is a property transfer deed," Brittany said, crossing her arms. "Jamal needs to secure a waterfront listing for his brokerage, and the bank is demanding more collateral. We are putting up your shabby little townhome. Do not worry, we will let you keep living in the basement until the loan is paid off." Jamal was her husband, a flashy real estate broker who loved projecting wealth he did not actually possess. The fact that they wanted to steal my home to fund his failing business was audacious, but the fact that they chose to do it while I was recovering in a hospital bed was pure evil. They truly believed I existed solely to absorb their financial burdens. I dropped the silver pen onto the blanket. "I am not signing over my home, Brittany. This is my property, and your husband's poor business decisions are not my responsibility." My mother finally looked up from her phone, letting out a loud theatrical sigh. "Clara, do not be so selfish. Your sister and Jamal are trying to build a legacy. The least you can do is help them. You do not even need a whole house for just yourself anyway. You have always been so stubborn." I stared at the woman who was supposed to protect me, feeling a deep familiar ache in my chest. "I am not being selfish, Mom. I am protecting my assets. I am not giving Jamal my house so he can gamble it away on another doomed venture." Brittany's face contorted with rage. Her perfectly manicured hands balled into tight fists. "You have always been a selfish little brat," she yelled, stepping closer to my bed. "Just like when you were 18 and you refused to sign over your college grant money so I could pay for my private sorority housing. You would rather see your own flesh and blood struggle than share what you have." "You mean the grant money I earned because you blew your college fund on designer bags and European vacations," I countered, feeling a surge of adrenaline cut through my exhaustion. "Shut your mouth," Brittany hissed. She lunged forward, her eyes wide with a manic desperation I had never seen before. Before I could react, she grabbed my arm and violently yanked the intravenous line right out of my vein. A sharp, burning pain shot up my arm. Blood immediately began to run down my skin, staining the white hospital sheets a bright crimson. I gasped, grabbing my arm to apply pressure. My mother took a sip of her drink, unfazed by the assault. "You should sign the papers, Clara," she said calmly, as if discussing the weather. Brittany smirked, leaning down so her face was inches from mine. "No one is going to believe you," she whispered. "You are just the crazy, overworked sister who pulled her own needle out in a panic." Then the heavy wooden door of my room swung open. Nurse Brenda stood in the doorway, her eyes blazing with fury as she looked at us. I saw everything she stated, her voice booming. "And the digital security footage has already been saved to the hospital cloud." The smug satisfaction on Brittany's face vanished. Her glossed lips parted in shock as she took a sudden step back from my bed, her hands raised defensively. The bravado she carried seconds prior evaporated under Nurse Brenda's furious glare. Brittany practically tripped over her own heels, retreating toward the window. "I was not hurting her," Brittany stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She was thrashing like a wild animal. She was having a fit, and I was trying to hold her down so she would not hurt herself. She pulled the needle out herself in a panic. I swear it is true." Nurse Brenda stepped fully into the room, letting the heavy door click shut. Her posture was rigid. "I have been a trauma nurse for 15 years, she said, her tone dangerously calm. "I know exactly what an assault looks like. Do not insult my intelligence. A patient recovering from exhaustion cannot miraculously gain the energy to rip out an intravenous line." I watched my sister shrink against the windowsill. The panic in her eyes was real now. She was not used to being caught, and she certainly was not used to facing actual consequences for her behavior. "I'm calling hospital security right now," Brenda continued, reaching for her pager. "And once they arrive, I am calling the Chicago Police Department to press charges for patient assault. You are leaving in handcuffs." That was the exact moment my mother decided to enter the fray. Until now, Diane had been a passive observer, perfectly content to let Brittany bully me. But the threat of her golden child facing criminal charges triggered a terrifying transformation. Diane dropped her iced matcha latte onto the floor. The cup cracked loudly, sending pale green liquid splashing across the linoleum, but she did not even glance down. She lunged forward, positioning her body between Brenda and Brittany like a shield. "You will do no such thing!" My mother snapped, her voice vibrating with a vicious energy. "You misunderstand the situation. If you call the police, I will ensure you lose your nursing license." Brenda did not back down an inch. "The security footage does not lie, ma'am." My mother ignored her completely. She reached into her expensive leather handbag, her hands moving with frantic precision. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. I knew exactly who she was calling. It was Arthur Vance, a bottom-feeding attorney known for handling messy divorces and sweeping wealthy people's indiscretions under the rug. "Arthur, it is!" "Diane," she barked into the phone the second the line connected. "I need you down at Chicago General Hospital immediately." "Yes, right now. It is an absolute emergency regarding my youngest daughter." I pressed a sterile gauze pad against my bleeding arm, wincing as the sharp sting radiated up to my shoulder. "Mom, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice still weak. She turned her back to me, speaking loudly into the phone so that both Brenda and I could hear every single word clearly. She wanted us to understand her power. "Arthur, the situation with Clara has escalated dramatically. It is what we feared. She is suffering from severe mental instability and aggressive delusions." My heart hammered painfully against my ribs as a deep, cold dread settled over me. I stared at her back in pure disbelief. She was rewriting reality right in front of my eyes. "She just had a massive psychiatric break," my mother continued into the receiver, pacing the length of the hospital room. "That is why she collapsed yesterday. It was not exhaustion from work. It was a complete mental breakdown. She is detached from reality. She just attacked her sister and ripped her own medical equipment out of her arm while screaming at us. We are terrified for her safety." Nurse Brenda opened her mouth to object, but my mother raised a hand, silencing her with a glare so toxic it could have peeled the paint off the hospital walls. "Yes, Arthur," my mother said, nodding emphatically. "I need you to draft the emergency medical and financial takeover documents right now. Print them and bring them straight to the VIP ward. Do whatever it takes to push it through the system quickly. I do not care who you have to bribe to make it happen before the end of the day. This is my priority." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. The frantic energy disappeared, replaced by a chilling, calculated calm. She slowly turned around to face me. The expression on her face was something out of a nightmare. Her eyes were completely dead, devoid of any maternal warmth, but her mouth stretched into a wide, terrifying smile. Brittany let out a long breath of relief, realizing her mother had just provided her with the ultimate alibi. If I was documented as legally insane, my testimony about the assault would mean absolutely nothing to the police or a judge. She would walk away completely scot-free. "You cannot do this," I said, gripping the cold metal bed rails. "You cannot just invent a psychiatric history because you got caught trying to steal my house. It is a severe crime to fabricate medical records and submit them to a judge." My mother walked slowly toward my bed. She reached out and gently smoothed a stray lock of hair away from my forehead with a fake motherly touch. The gesture was so violently out of context that it made my skin crawl and my stomach turn over in absolute disgust. "Do not worry, sweetie," my mother whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Mommy is going to take over all of your medical and financial decisions from now on. We are putting you in a strict conservatorship today. You clearly belong in a psych ward, and I am going to make sure you stay locked up in there until you learn exactly how to behave." The heavy hospital door swung open again before the chilling echo of my mother's threat could fully settle in the room. Jamal marched through the doorway. He was 36 years old and dressed exactly like a man desperately trying to convince the world he was rich. His custom-tailored maroon suit was undeniably expensive, but the sheer volume of sweat beading on his forehead and staining his silk collar betrayed the image he wanted to project. He owned a luxury real estate brokerage, a fact he made sure to mention within 5 minutes of meeting anyone. But right now, he looked like a man drowning in quicksand. Close on his heels was Arthur Vance, the cheap predatory family attorney my mother had just summoned over the phone. Arthur clutched a scuffed leather briefcase to his chest, his beady eyes darting around the VIP suite like a rat assessing a maze. He was the kind of lawyer who specialized in bullying vulnerable people into submission, and he clearly thought today would be an easy payday. Jamal took one look at the tension in the room, the blood soaking into my white sheets, and my sister trembling defensively by the window, and he immediately shifted into his practiced salesman persona. He walked over to the side of my bed, completely ignoring Nurse Brenda, who was still standing her ground near the doorway, with her hand hovering over her emergency pager. He plastered on a look of deep, brotherly concern, clasping his sweaty hands together in front of him. "Look, Clara." Jamal started, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy as he leaned over the bed rails. "We all know you have been under a lot of stress lately. You are just a low-level data entry clerk. You clock in, you clock out. You do not understand the overwhelming pressure of managing real finances or running a massive commercial enterprise. My brokerage is at a critical turning point. We need a massive cash injection immediately to secure an exclusive waterfront listing. It is a make-or-break deal for us, and the bank is demanding physical collateral by the end of the business day." He paused, leaning closer, invading my personal space with the overpowering scent of his heavy designer cologne. "Family helps family, Clara. That is just how the world works. Your mother and sister are just looking out for your best interests because you are clearly not in your right mind right now. Just sign the conservatorship papers Arthur brought, and sign the deed to the townhome. It is the pragmatic thing to do. I promise once the waterfront deal closes and the commission's clear, I will personally cover all your hospital bills. You will not have to worry about a single thing. We will take care of you." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his request, wrapped in that fake sugary concern, forced a weak, raspy laugh from my throat. My bruised ribs ached as I laughed, but I could not stop. I looked from Jamal to Brittany, then back to Jamal, seeing nothing but bottomless greed in their eyes. "Family," I echoed, letting the word hang heavily in the sterile hospital air. "Are you talking about the same family loyalty you showed me 5 years ago?" Jamal shifted his weight. his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Clara, this is not the time to bring up ancient history. But I was not going to let him brush it aside. Like how you two helped me by throwing my belongings on the front lawn in the middle of a Chicago snowstorm because I could not afford a sudden $500 rent increase. I asked, my voice growing colder and sharper with every word. I was 28 years old, working 2 minimum wage jobs to pay off my student loans, living in that cramped, drafty apartment above your garage. You knew I was completely broke. You knew I had absolutely nowhere else to go. But you wanted to convert the space into a luxury home gym, so you dumped my winter clothes, my textbooks, and my mattress into the freezing snow. I had to sleep in my freezing car for a week, while you two posted pictures of your new treadmills online. You did not care if I froze to death then, and you certainly do not care about my hospital bills now. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Brittany looked away suddenly, very interested in the hospital floor tiles. My mother simply rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed that I was holding on to past grievances while they were busy trying to steal my future. Jamal lost his patience completely. The sympathetic brother-in-law act vanished entirely, replaced by the ruthless, greedy opportunist he truly was. His jaw clenched tightly, and a thick vein throbbed visibly at his temple. He stepped aggressively toward my bed, snatched the heavy silver pen off the blanket where I had dropped it, and reached violently for my uninjured hand. He grabbed my wrist with a bruising force, prying my fingers open to force the metal pen into my palm. "Listen to me very carefully," he snarled, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged against my cheek. "You are going to sign these documents right now. You are going to sign over the property, and you are going to sign the conservatorship. If you do not, we will walk out that door and leave you here to rot in the psychiatric ward. Nobody is going to come looking for you. You have no money, you have no power, and you have no one else. Sign it." Arthur Vance stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents from his briefcase. He pushed them onto my lap, tapping the signature line with a manicured fingernail, a smug grin plastered across his face. I looked down at the pen forced into my hand, then up at Jamal's furious, sweating face. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I did not try to pull my arm away from his painful grip. Instead, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the man who thought he had me completely cornered, I simply used the fingers of my injured hand to reach across my body. I tapped a designated sequence on the face of my smartwatch. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," I whispered, my voice perfectly steady. Jamal let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the sterile walls of the hospital suite. He glanced down at the smartwatch on my wrist, his grip on my bruised arm tightening until I could feel my pulse throbbing against his fingers. "You think tapping a toy is going to save you?" he sneered, leaning his heavy frame closer to my face. "You are delusional, Clara. Sign the paper. Do not make me ask you again." I kept my eyes locked on his, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The pain radiating from where Brittany had torn out my intravenous line was intense, but the sheer satisfaction of knowing what was coming kept me perfectly anchored. I remained silent, counting the seconds in my head. My mother stood by the window, letting out a dramatic sigh of boredom. "Honestly, Clara," she complained, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere cardigan. "Stop making this so difficult. Jamal is giving you a way out. If you just cooperate, we will not have to lock you away in a psychiatric ward. We are doing this for your own good." Brittany nodded eagerly, her earlier panic completely erased by our mother's vicious lie. "Exactly," Brittany chimed in, stepping out from the corner. "You need serious help, Clara. You just attacked me. You are clearly a danger to yourself." The cheap family lawyer hovering behind Jamal checked his scuffed watch and cleared his throat. "We need to finalize this conservatorship quickly," he muttered, wiping sweat from his upper lip with the back of his hand. "The bank closes at 5, and we need the deed transferred before the weekend, or the whole deal falls through." I said nothing. I just kept counting. Exactly 3 minutes after I tapped my watch, the atmosphere in the hallway outside my room abruptly shifted. The usual soft chatter of nurses and the gentle hum of medical carts were entirely drowned out by the sound of heavy, synchronized footsteps. The rhythmic thud echoed down the corridor, moving with a fast, deliberate purpose that demanded absolute attention. Jamal froze, turning his head toward the door. The sleazy lawyer stopped wiping his forehead. Even my mother lowered her phone, her eyes narrowing as the heavy footsteps stopped right outside my room. The solid wooden door of the VIP suite did not just open, it was shoved wide open with commanding force. Two massive private security guards stepped into the room. They wore immaculate dark suits and earpieces, their expressions carved from solid stone, as they immediately flanked the doorway, assessing the room for threats with military precision. Behind them walked a man who instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. This was Attorney Kensington. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed of unimaginable wealth and raw power. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase and walked with the unbothered arrogance of an apex predator stepping into a cage of frantic mice. Kensington was not a strip mall attorney who handled minor domestic disputes. He was one of the most ruthless, high-profile corporate litigators in the United States. He was a man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies before breakfast. Jamal's cheap lawyer took one look at Kensington and physically recoiled. All the color drained from his face in a single second. He recognized Kensington immediately from legal trade magazines and high-stakes corporate trials. The sleazy attorney stumbled backward, bumping hard against the hospital wall, suddenly trying to make himself as invisible as humanly possible. Jamal looked completely confused by his lawyer's sudden terror. He puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his fading alpha male facade. "Who the hell are you?" Jamal demanded loudly, moving his body to block Kensington's path to my bed. "This is a private family matter. You need to leave right now." Kensington did not even grace Jamal with a single glance. He treated my brother-in-law like a smudge of dirt on the hospital floor. Without breaking his stride, Kensington walked straight past Jamal, his shoulder effortlessly brushing the bigger man aside, and stopped directly in front of my sister. Brittany shrank back against the wall, her eyes wide with sudden, genuine fear. Kensington snapped open his briefcase and pulled out a sleek black folder. He extended it toward her, holding it perfectly steady. "Take it." Kensington commanded, his voice a low, lethal baritone that brooked absolutely no argument. Brittany's hands were trembling violently as she reached out and took the folder. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak. Kensington slowly buttoned his suit jacket and looked down at her with absolute disdain. "You have been legally served," he announced, his words ringing crystal clear through the silent room. "That is an emergency restraining order signed by a judge less than 20 minutes ago. Effective immediately, you are legally mandated to maintain a distance of 500 feet from my client Clara at all times." Brittany dropped the folder as if it burned her fingers. The thick legal papers scattered across the floor, but Kensington was not finished. Furthermore, Kensington continued, his eyes locked onto Brittany's terrified face. "Nurse Brenda has already provided her official sworn witness statement to the authorities regarding your unprovoked physical assault on Clara this morning. Hospital security has preserved the video evidence. If you do not leave this room right now, you will be arrested for violating a court order before you even reach the hospital lobby." The room went completely dead silent. Jamal dropped my wrist as if he had been shocked by high-voltage electricity. He stepped back, staring at Kensington in absolute horror. My mother finally broke out of her paralyzed shock. She stepped forward, her eyes darting frantically between Kensington and me. Her gaze dragged up and down Kensington's custom suit, her mind desperately trying to process the exorbitant cost of his presence. She looked at the giant security details standing like statues at the door. Her brain struggled to compute the scenario unfolding in front of her. "Clara?" My mother sputtered, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me. "How are you paying for a Tier 1 lawyer? You are a broke nobody. You cannot even afford rent in a decent neighborhood. You are just a low-level data entry clerk. There is no way you can afford this level of legal representation." I took a slow, deep breath. The throbbing pain in my arm and my ribs suddenly faded completely into the background. I grabbed the edge of my hospital gown, adjusting the fabric as I pushed myself up to sit perfectly straight against the pillows. I looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes, and a cold, genuine smile finally formed on my lips. "Mom," I said, my voice steady and echoing with absolute quiet authority. Who do you think funded the multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence diagnostic equipment in this very VIP wing? The absolute silence in the VIP suite was deafening. For a long-stretched moment, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. My mother stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of the water. Brittany blinked rapidly, her gaze darting between the sleek, high-tech diagnostic machines lining the walls, and my face completely unable to process the question I had just asked. Who funded it? Jamal scoffed, breaking the silence with a harsh, nervous laugh. What are you talking about? The hospital funded it, or some billionaire corporate donor. You do not know anything about hospital administration, Clara. You just type numbers into a spreadsheet. I shook my head slowly, leaning back against my pillows. I do not type numbers into a spreadsheet, Jamal. I never did. For the past 10 years, I have been building a company from the ground up. I am the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of Neuraltech Medical Solutions, the artificial intelligence architecture running every single diagnostic machine in this hospital and in 400 other hospitals across the entire country is my proprietary design. My mother let out a sharp, sudden gasp. Her hand flew to her chest as she looked at Kensington, demanding an explanation, a denial, anything to prove I was lying. Attorney Kensington did not disappoint her, though not in the way she hoped. He smoothly opened his briefcase again and pulled out a thick, leather-bound hospital registry. He flipped to a marked page and held it out for them to see. My client is telling the absolute truth, Kensington stated, his voice resonating with undeniable authority. Neuraltech Medical Solutions is the primary benefactor of this entire VIP wing. In fact, her medical company is currently valued at over $800 million. She holds a 70% controlling stake. Clara is not just a patient here. She is the reason this ward exists. Brittany physically staggered backward as if Kensington had struck her across the face. The blood drained completely from her cheeks, leaving her looking sickly pale beneath her expensive contouring. Her jaw trembled. 800 million, she whispered the words, choking her. The sheer, unadulterated jealousy that contorted my sister's face was almost beautiful to witness. For 33 years, Brittany had built her entire identity on being the successful, beautiful, wealthy, favored golden child. She had mocked my clothes, my car, my supposedly pathetic career. Now standing in her designer dress that she likely bought on credit, she was forced to swallow the reality that the sister she tormented was nearly a billionaire. The loser she had just tried to frame for a psychiatric breakdown could buy and sell her entire life 50 times over without even checking her bank balance. No, Brittany stammered, shaking her head wildly. No, that is impossible. She is lying. She has to be lying. Look at her. She drives a 10-year-old sedan. She lives entirely in a rundown townhome. She is making this up. But Diane was not shaking her head. My mother's eyes had gone wide, calculating the numbers with terrifying speed. The shift in her demeanor was so abrupt, so sickeningly fast, it gave me emotional whiplash. The woman who less than 5 minutes ago was barking orders into her phone to have me locked in a psychiatric ward suddenly melted into a puddle of overwhelming maternal warmth. Arthur put those papers away. Diane snapped at her sleazy lawyer, waving a dismissive hand at the conservatorship documents he was still clutching. We will certainly not be needing those. She stepped forward, pushing past the private security guards who watched her every move. Her dead shark-like eyes were suddenly bright and brimming with fake, joyful tears. She clasped her hands over her heart and smiled at me like I was the center of her universe. Oh, my brilliant, beautiful girl. Diane cooed, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I always knew it. I always knew you were a secret genius. You were always so quiet, so focused. I used to tell your father Clara is going to surprise us all one single beautiful day. I stared at her, feeling a massive wave of pure nausea wash over me. You literally just tried to have me declared legally insane, Mom. You tried to steal my house. Diane waved her hand in the air, batting away the accusation like it was a minor annoyance. Oh, Clara, please. You know how protective I am. I was just testing you. I wanted to see if you had the spine to stand up for yourself. And look at you. You passed with flying colors. I am so incredibly proud of you, sweetheart. She took another quick step closer to the bed, dropping the motherly pride and shifting straight into the predatory greed I knew so well. Since you are so extraordinarily wealthy, you absolutely have to help us. We are family after all. Jamal's business is drowning Clara. He made some exceptionally bad investments, and if he does not get a cash injection by tomorrow, he is going to lose his brokerage. You cannot let your sister's husband go bankrupt when you have hundreds of millions of dollars just sitting in the bank. At the mention of the money, Jamal seemed to snap out of his stunned paralysis completely. The realization of my net worth hit him like a lightning bolt. His eyes widened, glowing with unadulterated greed. Move! Jamal grunted, shoving Brittany aside so hard she stumbled into the window frame. He rushed toward my bed, ignoring the two massive security guards who shifted their weight ready to intervene. Clara, listen to me, he pleaded. If you have that kind of capital, a $2 million loan is pocket change to you. Save my brokerage. I am your brother-in-law. I looked at him deadpan. I don't need to loan you $2 million, Jamal. I smiled coldly. I let the silence stretch out, watching the desperate hope completely freeze on Jamal's sweating face. He blinked rapidly, clearly trying to process what my rejection meant for his crumbling business. His perfectly tailored maroon suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. With a subtle nod, I signaled Attorney Kensington. My lawyer did not miss a beat. He smoothly reached into his sleek leather briefcase a second time and withdrew a separate, incredibly thick legal binder. He stepped past my mother, completely ignoring her presence, and dropped the binder onto my hospital bed. It landed with a loud, satisfying thud. I do not need to loan you $2 million, Jamal, I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm, because I already own you. Jamal stared at the binder as if it were an explosive. What are you talking about? He stammered, his eyes darting from the documents to my face. You are a tech CEO, not a real estate investor. You do not own anything of mine at all. I reached over and flipped the binder open with my uninjured hand. For a man who claims to be a titan of the Chicago luxury real estate market, you are remarkably careless with your public financial records, Jamal. 3 weeks ago, my primary investment firm utilized an anonymous shell company to purchase distressed commercial debt from your lenders. His jaw dropped. The deep brown of his complexion took on a very sickly ashen hue. I traced my finger down the first page of the legal documents. I bought up every single one of your defaulted commercial loans. I bought the heavily leveraged mortgages on your supposedly successful brokerage offices. I even bought the mezzanine debt you took out to finance that ridiculous yacht. No! Jamal gasped, his knees buckling as he grabbed the edge of my mattress to steady himself. No. The bank said those notes were being transferred to a private equity firm in New York. They said I had a 90-day grace period to restructure my assets. They lied. Kensington interjected, his voice sharp and utterly merciless. Or rather, they were legally bound by non-disclosure agreements to conceal the true identity of the purchasing entity. The grace period you negotiated was contingent on strict adherence to your existing liquidity covenants. You were forbidden from taking on further obligations. I looked right at Brittany, who was pressing her back against the window frame, as if trying to melt through the glass. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, I stated smoothly, I am your sole creditor. And because you breached those strict liquidity clauses last week to buy your wife leased sports cars, I am officially foreclosing on your entire brokerage. Jamal let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. His legs finally gave out. He fell to his knees on the hard floor. He grabbed the paperwork, his hands shaking violently. He stared at the bold legal letterheads, reading the numbers that dictated his financial ruin. He slowly turned his head to look at my sister. The desperation in his eyes morphed instantly into blinding, unhinged rage. You told me she was broke? Jamal screamed, his voice echoing off the hospital walls. You told me she was a pathetic clerk. You said we could steal her house to cover our margins? Brittany flinched, holding her hands up defensively. I did not know, she shrieked back, her perfectly pitched voice cracking into a shrill whine. She hid this from us. How was I supposed to know she was running an $800 million medical company? She drives a 10-year-old car. You stupid, arrogant woman, Jamal roared, scrambling to his feet and pointing a finger directly at her face. You convinced me to forge conservatorship papers. You convinced me to commit a felony today. Do you have any idea what you have done? We are finished. My business is gone. I am going to prison because of your ridiculous obsession with looking richer than your friends. I watched them tear into each other, feeling nothing. For years I had endured their condescension. I absorbed their snide comments at every holiday dinner, sitting silently while they mocked my lifestyle and bragged about their leased cars. They had built their marriage on fake wealth and cruelty. Seeing them turn on each other the second their house of cards collapsed was the justice I had been waiting for. I am not taking the fall for this, Brittany yelled, tears of genuine panic finally streaming down her face and ruining her makeup. You are the one who mismanaged the business for years. You are the one who took out those high-interest loans. Stop it, my mother bellowed. Diane stepped away from the window, inserting herself between Jamal and Brittany. Her face was no longer pale. It had turned a dark, furious red. The sweet mother act she had tried to pull moments earlier was gone, replaced by venomous, cornered desperation. She turned her back on Jamal and Brittany, fixing her terrifying gaze entirely on me. Her chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths. She looked at Kensington in his custom suit, looked at the towering security guards, and looked right into my eyes. You little viper! Diane hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural whisper. You think you are so smart. You think you can humiliate your family and destroy your sister's life without facing any consequences. You think you have won because you have a fancy lawyer and a bank account full of corporate money. I raised my chin, meeting her furious glare without a single ounce of fear. I have won, Mom. It is over. You have no leverage left. Diane took a slow, deliberate step closer to my bed. A twisted, triumphant sneer curled the corners of her mouth. Oh, I have plenty of leverage, Clara. You see, I know where you got your startup capital. My mother threw her shoulders back, attempting to project an aura of absolute moral superiority. She turned away from my bed and addressed the entire room, her gaze sweeping over the two massive private security guards and finally locking onto Attorney Kensington. Diane knew she was losing her grip on the situation, and when Diane lost control, she went straight for the throat. She decided in that split second to completely obliterate my reputation in front of the very people I had hired to protect me. Do you have any idea who you are actually representing? Diane demanded, her voice echoing loudly off the sterile white walls of the VIP suite. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with manufactured outrage. You think she is some kind of brilliant tech visionary? You think she is a self-made billionaire who pulled herself up by her bootstraps? She is nothing but a common thief and a fraud. Kensington did not react. He remained standing with perfect, terrifying posture, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. He simply watched my mother the way a scientist might observe a completely predictable rat in a maze. His silence only infuriated her further. When her father died 12 years ago, Diane declared, her voice breaking with a perfectly rehearsed sob that I had seen her use 100 times before to manipulate bank tellers and luxury retail managers. He left a $500,000 life insurance policy. That money was meant to secure the future for our entire family. It was meant to pay off our mortgage, to help Brittany finish her communications degree, and to keep us afloat during the darkest period of our lives. She stepped closer to Kensington, trying to force him to acknowledge her pain. But she did not let us see a single dime of it, Diane hissed, gesturing wildly toward my hospital bed. When Clara was 23 years old, she illegally accessed her father's private financial accounts. She hacked into the banking portal, completely bypassed my legal authorization as his widow, and transferred every single penny of that life insurance payout into an offshore account. She stole our survival money and ran away to start her little technology company. The sheer magnitude of the lie hung heavily in the air. It was a spectacular fabrication woven with just enough emotional desperation to sound plausible to a complete stranger. She left her sister and me with absolutely nothing. Diane continued, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch as she noticed the security guards shifting uncomfortably by the door. We almost lost the house. We had to scrape by on credit cards and empty promises while she used her dead father's money to build an empire. She is a criminal. If you do not rip up that ridiculous restraining order and cancel the foreclosure on Jamal right now, I will walk straight out of this hospital and go directly to the press. Diane paused, letting her chest heave for dramatic effect before delivering her final, desperate ultimatum. I will call the Wall Street Journal. I will call the federal authorities. I will have you arrested and indicted for wire fraud and grand larceny before the sun goes down today. I will burn your entire fake company to the ground. The hospital room went completely suffocatingly silent. The steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor was the only sound cutting through the heavy tension. The blood staining my sheets seemed to dry and crackle in the freezing atmosphere my mother had just created. Jamal and Brittany immediately stopped their vicious, throat-tearing argument. The sheer hatred they had been directing at each other dissolved in an instant, replaced by a sudden, sickening spark of pure, unadulterated hope. Jamal slowly lowered his hands, his eyes darting between my mother and me. His calculating, sleazy mind was already working overtime, processing this new information. If Clara was genuinely a fraud, if she was truly terrified of going to federal prison, then she could be blackmailed. A $2 million loan to save his failing real estate brokerage would be absolute pocket change compared to the cost of keeping a multi-million-dollar wire fraud scandal out of the national headlines. Brittany wiped the ruined mascara from her cheeks, a smug, nasty little smile creeping back onto her lips. She crossed her arms, looking at me as if I was already wearing an orange jumpsuit. They both truly believed my mother had just handed them the ultimate trump card. Kensington did not flinch. He did not look surprised, and he certainly did not look intimidated by my mother's screaming threats of federal investigations. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. His expression remained entirely neutral, but his eyes conveyed a silent, professional question. He was waiting for my command. He was ready to legally eviscerate the woman standing in front of him, but he needed to know if I wanted him to handle it, or if I was going to deliver the final blow myself. I sat perfectly still against the hospital pillows. My bruised ribs ached with every breath, and the bandage on my arm throbbed, but my mind was operating with absolute crystal-clear precision. I did not raise my voice. I did not frantically deny the accusations. I did not try to explain to Kensington or the guards that my mother had actually spent the life insurance money on a horrific gambling addiction and luxury European vacations, while I worked 3 jobs to keep the electricity on. I did not need to defend myself with mere words. I had prepared for this exact confrontation for nearly a decade. Without breaking direct eye contact with my mother, I reached for my smartphone resting on the rolling bedside table. I opened a specific encrypted audio file and set the device down. You really shouldn't have brought up Dad's life insurance, Mom. I tapped the glowing play icon on my smartphone screen. A sharp crackle of static filled the sterile hospital suite, followed immediately by the deep, unmistakable baritone of my late father. The sound of his voice, recorded just 3 days before his sudden death, seemed to suck the remaining oxygen straight out of the room. I am setting up a blind trust solely in your name. My father's recorded voice echoed heavily, weighted with exhaustion and a grim sense of finality. Do not let your mother know. She will drain it to fund Brittany's vanity projects. Protect yourself, Clara. The audio file clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor was the only sound anchoring us to reality. Diane stood entirely frozen, her mouth slightly open, the venomous fire in her eyes extinguishing instantly into sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from her face so rapidly that her expensive blush stood out like war paint against her sickly pale skin. Brittany let out a choked gasp, physically stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wall. The golden child facade shattered completely. Hearing her own father, the man whose wealth she had squandered and whose memory she had weaponized explicitly, refer to her entire life as nothing more than vanity projects, was a devastating blow. Her lower lip trembled violently. The realization that she was never the favorite, but rather the financial burden, destroyed her completely. Jamal took another step away from my sister, his expression twisting into a mask of pure disgust. The realization that he had married into a family of complete frauds, a family whose own patriarch knew they were financial parasites, was finally sinking in. He was ruined, and he knew these two women were exactly to blame. He looked at Brittany with absolute loathing, realizing his entire marriage was a scam. I kept my gaze locked onto my mother. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of the rage that had fueled me for the past decade. I simply nodded toward Attorney Kensington. Kensington moved with the lethal precision of a striking viper. He unfastened the brass clasps of his leather briefcase and reached inside, bypassing the standard legal folders to withdraw a single heavily protected manila envelope. He slid a thick, crisp document from the casing. This was not a standard hospital bill or a simple bank ledger. Stamped vividly across the top right corner of the crisp paper was the unmistakable, deeply intimidating red seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Kensington stepped directly into my mother's personal space. He did not ask her to take the document. He forced it into her trembling hands, his towering presence casting a long, dark shadow over her shrinking frame. The two massive security guards flanking the doorway shifted their stances, their expressions carved from solid granite as they observed the utter destruction of my mother's ego. "The money was never stolen, Mom," I stated, my voice echoing with quiet, ruthless authority. "You did not lose a single dime to a mysterious hacker, and I certainly did not steal my own inheritance. You know exactly what happened 5 years ago. You attempted to drain the entire blind trust. You forged my signature on 7 different wire transfer authorizations, attempting to funnel that $500,000 into your private offshore gambling accounts to cover your catastrophic debts." Diane tried to speak, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. Her eyes remained glued to the bright red FBI seal, her manicured fingers shaking so violently that the thick paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. "You committed a severe federal crime," I continued, leaning back slightly against the hospital pillows. "The only reason you did not go to federal prison back then, the only reason you are not currently wearing an orange jumpsuit and sleeping on a concrete cot, is because Dad's estate lawyer was brilliant. He caught your fraudulent activity immediately. Before your forged transfers could clear the federal clearinghouse, he quietly and legally moved the entirety of the funds into a secure, untouchable corporate account." Kensington adjusted his custom suit jacket, his cold eyes fixed directly on my mother. "Your crime failed at the absolute final second, Diane. You were saved from a federal indictment simply by your own sheer incompetence. I utilized that perfectly preserved trust as the initial seed money to build neural tech," I explained, watching the devastating reality completely crush her spirit. "My company is literally built on the foundation of Dad's protection against your relentless greed. Every single diagnostic machine on this floor, every algorithm saving lives across the country exists because Dad knew exactly what kind of financial predator you truly were." Diane was entirely paralyzed. The document in her hands represented the absolute destruction of the fabricated reality she had lived in for years. She had spent a decade playing the ultimate victim, painting me as a ruthless thief to anyone who would listen, all while knowing she was the one who had committed the felony. I pushed myself forward on the mattress. The dull ache in my bruised ribs faded into the background, completely overshadowed by the surging adrenaline of total, undeniable victory. I stared into my mother's terrified, wide eyes and lowered my voice to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Speaking of federal investigations," I murmured, letting the distinct threat hang heavily in the freezing air, "the Internal Revenue Service has been very interested in your tax returns lately. It seems your highly creative accounting methods regarding your remaining assets have finally triggered a massive, unavoidable audit." Diane let out a ragged, whimpering breath. Her knees knocked together and she looked desperately toward the heavy wooden door, realizing that the massive security guards blocking the exit were not just keeping her in. They were keeping the federal authorities out, but only for now. "But we can talk about that tonight," I added smoothly, a razor-sharp smile finally forming on my face. I reached over with my uninjured arm and gently adjusted the sleek, high-tech smartwatch on my wrist. After all, we would not want to miss Brittany's highly publicized charity gala, would we? 7 hours later, the sterile scent of hospital bleach had been entirely replaced by the suffocating aroma of expensive floral arrangements and vintage champagne. The grand ballroom of the downtown Chicago hotel was a masterclass in high society illusion. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the imported silk tablecloths, illuminating a cavernous room packed tightly with the city's most affluent investors, venture capitalists, and corporate socialites. It was Brittany's annual Mental Health Awareness Charity Gala. On paper, it was a noble philanthropic endeavor designed to raise funds for local wellness clinics. In reality, it was a desperate, thinly veiled networking event. Tonight, it was the final frantic Hail Mary to save Jamal's imploding real estate brokerage. I stood in the heavy velvet shadows of the mezzanine balcony, watching the pathetic performance unfold below me with cold, calculated precision. The sheer audacity of my family was genuinely staggering to witness. Down on the main floor, Jamal was working the room with the frantic, terrified energy of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. He was stuffed into a tuxedo that looked slightly too tight across his broad shoulders, his forehead gleaming with a thick layer of nervous sweat. He bounced from group to group, flashing a desperate, predatory smile for the roaming event photographers, aggressively shoving his business card into the hands of billionaires who looked at him with polite, thinly veiled boredom. He was practically begging for capital injections, frantically pitching fake commercial development projects, completely unaware that the very people he was attempting to schmooze were already doing business with my subsidiaries. Near the extravagant, towering ice sculpture at the center of the room, my mother was putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of her own. Diane was draped in an emerald green designer gown, a glass of expensive champagne clutched so tightly in her manicured hand that her knuckles were entirely white. She threw her head back, laughing loudly at a joke made by the wife of a pharmaceutical chief executive, playing the role of the unbothered wealthy matriarch to absolute perfection. But from my elevated vantage point, I could see the rigid, terrified tension locking her shoulders. I could see the way her eyes darted frantically toward the ballroom exits every few minutes. The terrifying specter of an Internal Revenue Service audit and a federal wire fraud investigation was eating her alive from the inside out. Yet she continued to sip her champagne and smile, utterly trapped in the prison of her own fabricated social standing. The low, elegant hum of string instruments and clinking glasses was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, echoing tap of a microphone. The brilliant ballroom lights dimmed rapidly, focusing a single blinding spotlight onto the main stage. Brittany stepped up to the podium, soaking in the undivided attention, like parched earth absorbing rain. She was wearing a breathtaking custom-beaded couture gown that I knew for a definitive fact had been leased on a line of credit Jamal could no longer afford to pay. She gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, bowing her head for a long, dramatic moment of silence, forcing the wealthy crowd to hang on her every movement. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Brittany began, her voice perfectly modulated to sound thick with unshed, majestic tears. She looked out over the sea of wealthy donors, pressing a trembling hand over her heart. Mental health is a silent, creeping epidemic. It destroys lives, it shatters families, and it leaves a trail of unimaginable devastation in its wake. She paused, letting a single perfectly timed tear escape her eye and roll slowly down her heavily contoured cheek. "For my family, this cause is not just a charity. It is a deeply personal, ongoing tragedy that we fight every single day." Brittany leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping to a theatrical, heartbroken whisper that echoed through the massive speakers. "Many of you know my sister Clara. What you do not know is the agonizing, terrifying battle she has been fighting behind closed doors. Just this morning, my mother and I We're forced to make the most difficult, painful decision of our entire lives. My own sister suffered a complete violent psychotic break. She attacked me, and she is currently institutionalized in a secure psychiatric ward. She has severe psychiatric struggles, and we are broken. A collective sympathetic gasp rippled through the ballroom. Socialites covered their mouths in perfectly choreographed shock. Investors shook their heads in somber understanding. Jamal stood near the front row looking down at his expensive leather shoes, playing the part of the supportive, grieving brother-in-law. Diane wiped a completely dry eye with a lace handkerchief. It broke my absolute heart to leave her there in that sterile room. Brittany continued, her voice trembling with fake bravery. But I knew I had to be here tonight. I had to stand before you and turn my family's private nightmare into a public beacon of hope. This charity is my way of healing. Every dollar you donate tonight goes toward ensuring that families like mine do not have to suffer in the dark. Please open your hearts and open your checkbooks in honor of Clara. The wealthy donors were completely captivated by the manipulation. The room erupted into a wave of polite, thunderous applause. People were already reaching into their tailored jackets for their gold-plated donation pens, eager to fund Brittany's healing journey. Brittany stood in the spotlight, wiping her fake tears, a triumphant, greedy smile attempting to break through her sorrowful facade. She thought she had won. Just as the applause reached a deafening crescendo, the heavy mahogany double doors at the absolute back of the grand ballroom did not just open, they were violently shoved apart with a concussive crash that shook the walls of the luxury hotel. The brass handles slammed into the plaster, shattering it. The ambient music cut out completely, plunging the room into silence. Every single head in the cavernous, glittering room snapped toward the dark entrance, simultaneously searching for the source. I stood perfectly framed inside the grand archway, bathed in the harsh light bleeding in from the corridor. I was no longer the bruised, vulnerable, and heavily medicated woman who had been forcibly trapped in a suffocating hospital gown earlier that very same day. I was wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue power suit that hugged my frame with structural precision. The blazer featured severe, angular shoulders that projected absolute authority, paired with trousers that fell flawlessly over stiletto heels. My hair was styled in a sleek, uncompromising sweep, and my makeup was immaculate. I looked radiantly wealthy, undeniably powerful, and completely terrifyingly sane. I did not come alone. Flanking my right side was Attorney Kensington, his posture rigid and his expression carved from glacial ice, radiating a silent promise of legal devastation. Behind him stood the two massive private security guards, their dark suits straining against their broad shoulders, their hands resting neutrally but menacingly at their belts. But the most devastating additions to my entourage flanked my left. Three individuals moved in perfect synchronized step with me, wearing nondescript charcoal suits that screamed federal authority. Hanging from thick woven lanyards around their necks were highly visible government identification badges. They were state auditors from the Attorney General's Office of Charitable Oversight. Their eyes swept over the lavish ballroom, the ice sculptures and the designer gowns, mentally calculating the fraudulent excess of Brittany's so-called mental health fundraiser. They carried thick black leather briefcases packed with the subpoenas I had personally expedited over the last 6 hours. A stunned, breathless silence swallowed the room whole. The wealthy elite of Chicago venture capitalist hedge fund managers and philanthropic socialites stood paralyzed, their champagne flutes suspended halfway to their mouths. Some of the older investors recognized me immediately from tech industry magazine covers, their eyes widening in sudden horrifying realization of the massive scam they were currently attending. On the brightly lit stage, Brittany's meticulously crafted facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces, her jaw unhinged. The manicured hand holding the microphone began to tremble so violently that her diamond bracelets rattled. Her fingers went entirely numb. The heavy silver microphone slipped from her grasp and plummeted downward, hitting the polished wooden stage with a sharp, ear-splitting feedback squeal. The deafening screech ripped through the ballroom speakers, forcing several donors in the front row to flinch and cover their ears. Brittany did not move a single muscle. She simply stared at me, her face draining of all color, until she looked like a beautifully dressed corpse. Down on the main floor, Jamal had been mid-sentence, eagerly attempting to secure a massive commercial loan from a prominent real estate developer. When the doors crashed open and he saw the state auditors marching beside me, Jamal froze entirely. His hand remained suspended in the air, waiting for a handshake that would never come. The wealthy investor he was pitching to took one look at my entrance, looked back at Jamal's sweating, terrified face, and immediately pulled his hand away in disgust, backing into the crowd to distance himself from the impending fallout. Jamal's chest heaved rapidly under his tight tuxedo. His eyes darted toward the emergency exit signs, glowing red above the service corridors, a cornered rat, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. Across the room, Diane abandoned every single ounce of her aristocratic pretense. The moment she spotted Attorney Kensington and the government badges, the fearless matriarch scrambled backward. She practically dove behind a massive, cascading arrangement of white orchids and lilies, her emerald green designer gown catching on the thorns. She desperately tried to shrink her body into the shadows, a pathetic attempt to hide from the reality that her entire world was collapsing in real time. I stepped forward, breaking the threshold of the entryway. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. I did not scream. I did not shout. I did not throw wild accusations or act like the unhinged, hysterical sibling my sister had just spent 20 minutes describing to the city's wealthiest citizens. I let my presence do the talking. My heels clicked methodically, rhythmically, against the marble floor, each sharp tap echoing through the dead, silent room, like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of their fraudulent empire. The crowd parted seamlessly before me, wealthy donors stepping aside to create a wide, clear path to the stage, watching me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. I reached the base of the stage and climbed the 3 stairs with measured, deliberate grace. Brittany scrambled backward, her expensive heels tripping over the microphone cord, pressing herself against the promotional banner bearing her charity's fake logo. I did not even look at her. I simply bent down and picked up the discarded microphone from the floor. The feedback had died away, leaving the room practically humming with anticipation. I dusted off the silver mesh grill with a casual flick of my wrist, testing the weight of it in my hand. I stepped directly into the center of the blinding spotlight, taking the exact place my sister had occupied just moments before. I looked out over the sea of 500 horrified, captivated faces, my gaze sweeping across the room until it locked onto the floral arrangement, where my mother was cowering in absolute terror. I raised the microphone to my lips, looking directly into the cameras, as a slow, victorious smile spread across my face. "Good evening," I said, my voice echoing with clear, icy composure. "I am the institutionalized sister." The absolute silence in the grand ballroom deepened, transforming from mere shock into a palpable, vibrating tension. 500 of Chicago's wealthiest and most influential citizens stared at me, their eyes darting between my perfectly tailored suit and the terrified, trembling wreck of a woman standing just 3 feet to my left. I did not look like a woman suffering from a psychotic break. I looked like a woman who owned the building. Allow me to properly introduce myself to those of you I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting in boardrooms or closed-door negotiations. I continued, my voice steady, projecting crystal-clear authority through the massive speakers. I am Clara. I am not a tragic charity case, and I am certainly not a patient in a psychiatric ward. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Neural Tech Medical Artificial Intelligence. A collective audible gasp rippled through the sea of designer gowns and custom tuxedos. The immediate shift in the room's energy was electric. Murmurs broke out like a sudden wildfire. I saw the mayor of Chicago lean forward in his front row seat, his eyes widening in sudden recognition. Several high-profile venture capitalists in the center tables actively began pointing at me, whispering frantically to their partners. Neural tech software was currently being utilized by 3 of the largest hospital networks in the state. Many of the billionaires sitting in this very room had personally invested in those hospital networks. They knew my company, they knew my technology, and now they finally knew my face. I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with my sister. Brittany looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her chest heaved, and the heavy stage makeup could no longer hide the sheer panicked pallor of her skin. Down on the floor, Diane was still cowering behind the floral arrangement, while Jamal looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. Their entire world was collapsing in real time, and they had no way to stop the impending devastation. I want to extend my deepest, most heartfelt thanks to my sister Brittany, I said, turning back to the mesmerized crowd. My voice dripped with lethal, icy sarcasm that cut through the remaining murmurs. It is truly touching that she dedicated this extravagant mental health awareness gala to me. Her dedication is legendary. Brittany let out a strangled, desperate noise. She lunged forward, her high heels catching on the carpeted stage as she frantically reached for the microphone in my hand. "Clara, stop it right now," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper, intended only for my ears. "Are you completely insane? You are ruining us in front of the mayor. You are destroying my entire life. Put the microphone down and get off my stage before I have security throw you out into the street." I did not even blink. With a fluid, practiced motion, I smoothly sidestepped her desperate grab. Brittany stumbled awkwardly, barely catching her balance against the heavy wooden podium. I signaled with a slight tilt of my head to the AV booth suspended at the back of the ballroom where my own private security team had secured the controls. "I am not here to accept your charitable donations tonight," I announced, my voice rising powerfully over Brittany's frantic, hushed threats. "I am not here to be a prop in a fabricated tragedy designed to open your checkbooks and fund their luxurious lifestyles. I am here in my capacity as a corporate officer, alongside the State Attorney General's auditors, to formally announce my company's hostile takeover of this foundation." The murmurs in the crowd instantly escalated into an uproar. Men in expensive suits stood up from their tables in shock. The state auditors, flanking Attorney Kensington down on the floor, stood at attention, their government badges catching the bright chandelier light, validating every single word leaving my mouth. The trap had snapped shut. Brittany grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into the fabric of my suit jacket. "You cannot do this," she whimpered, tears of genuine panic finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her mascara. "This is my charity. This is my foundation. I built this from nothing. You have absolutely no right to take it away." I yanked my arm out of her grip with such force that she physically recoiled. I leaned into the microphone, commanding the room's undivided attention once more. "For the past 5 years, my sister has stood on this stage and asked for your trust," I declared, letting my gaze sweep across the captivated faces of the city's most powerful elite. "She has asked for your millions, claiming every dollar was funding critical mental health resources and community outreach programs for the most vulnerable among us. She painted a beautiful picture of philanthropy and healing. But the truth is far more lucrative and infinitely more sinister." I paused, letting the heavy, damning accusations settle over the silent, captivated audience. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could be sliced with a blade. No one dared to breathe as they waited for my devastating blow. "I think our generous donors would love to see exactly where their millions of dollars in mental health funding have been going for the past 5 years, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, unrelenting finality. I kept my eyes locked on the horrified, mesmerized crowd. With a sharp, decisive gesture, I pointed toward the massive 60-foot projector screen suspended behind the stage. The AV booth followed my exact command without hesitation. The elegant, carefully crafted high society illusion was completely and utterly over. The ballroom's ambient lighting darkened completely. A loud, heavy electronic hum vibrated through the thick floorboards. The massive screen flickered to life, illuminating the suffocating darkness with a brilliant, blinding white light. The absolute, undeniable destruction of their entire fraudulent empire was about to be broadcast for the entire world to see. The blinding white light on the screen quickly resolved into stark, high-definition clarity. The elegant ballroom, previously bathed in warm golden hues, was cast in the harsh blue glow of a massive financial autopsy. I stood at the podium gripping the polished wood, letting the sheer magnitude of the visual sink into the minds of every billionaire and socialite present. Behind me, a towering pie chart materialized, segmented in bright, unmistakable colors, alongside corresponding columns of raw banking data, offshore routing numbers, and highly classified wire transfer logs. The state auditors standing at attention down on the main floor had executed their forensic accounting with absolute terrifying perfection. I clicked the remote in my hand, and a red laser pointer dot appeared on the center of the screen, highlighting a sprawling web of dummy corporations. As you can clearly see, I narrated, my voice echoing with brutal efficiency over the stunned crowd. 80% of the public donations intended for severe psychiatric care and community mental health resources never reached a single clinic. Instead, those millions of charitable dollars were routed through a phantom shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. I clicked the remote again. The pie chart dissolved, replaced by a glaringly obvious flowchart mapping the stolen funds. That exact corporation then funneled the cash directly into the operating accounts of Jamal's commercial real estate brokerage. I paused, letting my eyes sweep the floor until I found him sweating and paralyzed in his tuxedo. He used your generous tax-deductible donations to artificially inflate his abysmal sales numbers, creating phantom property acquisitions to fool his legitimate investors into believing his failing firm was actually highly profitable. The murmurs of the crowd escalated into a sharp collective hiss of outrage. The wealthy venture capitalists who had just spent the last hour listening to Jamal's desperate, aggressive pitches suddenly looked at him with absolute, unadulterated venom. The illusion of his business acumen was completely vaporized, replaced by the ugly reality of grand larceny. Jamal stumbled backward, his face turning an alarming shade of gray as the people he had been desperately schmoozing physically stepped away from him, treating him like a highly contagious disease. He looked up at the screen, his mouth opening and closing, as he stared at his own hidden bank account numbers displayed for the entire city elite to examine. But the financial parasitism of my family does not end there, I stated smoothly, pressing the button on my remote again. A new slide popped up on the display featuring a meticulously categorized spreadsheet of exorbitant personal expenses alongside scanned copies of heavily redacted legal contracts. Another 15% of your donated charity funds was dispersed as what the foundation categorized as administrative consulting fees. These fees were paid directly to a private consultant. I looked directly at the cascading floral arrangement where my mother was still attempting to cower in the shadows. That consultant is my mother, Diane. The screen transitioned to a side-by-side comparison. On the left were the dates and amounts of the so-called consulting payouts drained from the charity. On the right were matching dates and identical dollar amounts charged to Diane's platinum credit cards. The correlation was undeniable. These administrative fees, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the ballroom, precisely match her personal expenditures at luxury designer boutiques, high-end jewelers, and five-star resorts across Europe over the past 48 months. Your philanthropic donations did not buy medication or fund therapy programs. They bought custom Italian leather handbags, first-class tickets to Milan, and exclusive spa treatments in the Swiss Alps. Diane let out a loud, pathetic whimper that carried in the shocked silence of the room. Several high society matrons who had just been drinking vintage champagne with her moments ago turned to stare at the floral arrangement with expressions of pure revulsion. Diane sank lower to the floor, her emerald gown bunching up around her knees, completely destroyed by the irrefutable evidence of her staggering greed. The atmosphere in the luxurious ballroom shifted from stunned disbelief to absolute outrage. The wealthy donors, politicians, and corporate executives realized simultaneously that they had been scammed by a family of incompetent frauds. Across the room, dozens of smartphones were immediately whipped out of expensive purses and tailored pockets. Flashing lights of recording cameras illuminated the darkness, capturing every single damning slide on the projector screen and every panicked expression on my family's faces. The city's most powerful individuals were documenting the exact moment the charity foundation was brutally dismantled. To my left, a prominent tech investor who had just promised Jamal a substantial influx of capital reached into his breast pocket. He withdrew his checkbook, ripped out the freshly written check, and tore it into pieces, letting the shredded paper fall onto the toes of Jamal's polished shoes. Other investors followed suit, turning their backs on the ruined real estate broker with utter contempt. Jamal stood completely frozen, watching his entire future, his business, his wealth, and his freedom disintegrate into nothingness. The sheer weight of impending federal indictments and total financial ruin finally snapped the last remaining thread of his fragile composure. The desperate, predatory smile vanished, replaced by a mask of wild panic. He realized his life was entirely over, and survival instinct kicked in with vicious, primitive force. Jamal let out a guttural, furious shout that echoed over the angry murmurs of the crowd. He shoved past a wealthy socialite, nearly knocking her to the marble floor, and ran frantically toward the center aisle. He sprinted directly toward the brightly lit stage, his eyes wide and bloodshot, completely ignoring the imposing presence of the federal auditors and the massive security guards blocking the stairs. He did not look at me. He stopped at the very edge of the stage, his chest heaving violently, and pointed a visibly trembling accusatory finger straight at the horrified, speechless form of his wife. Jamal did not simply walk onto the stage. He clawed his way up the polished wooden steps, his expensive leather shoes slipping as he propelled his heavy frame toward the microphone. His face was a glistening mask of absolute terror, sweat pouring down his forehead and soaking the stiff collar of his designer tuxedo. He bypassed me completely, his wild, bloodshot eyes locked onto Brittany, who was backed against the promotional banner of her ruined charity. The wealthy crowd watched in stunned, breathless fascination as the polished real estate broker devolved into a cornered animal. "I had nothing to do with this," Jamal bellowed, his voice raw as he projected it over the murmurs of the outraged donors. He spun around frantically, addressing the sea of billionaires and the stone-faced state auditors near the entrance. "I swear to God I did not know. I am a victim here, just like all of you." He turned his trembling, accusatory finger back toward his wife. "Brittany handled every single cent of the charity finances," he screamed, his chest heaving violently. "She controlled the shell corporations. She managed the offshore accounts. When she transferred those funds into my brokerage, she looked me dead in the eye and told me they were legitimate cash injections from anonymous angel investors. She told me it was clean venture capital. She lied to me. She manipulated my business to hide her own federal crimes. I am completely innocent." Brittany stared at her husband, completely paralyzed by the magnitude of his sudden treason. The devastating reality crashed over her. Not only was her high society facade destroyed, but the man she conspired with was instantly sacrificing her to save his own skin. The shock rapidly morphed into blinding, unadulterated rage. Her manicured hands curled into tight, trembling fists now. "You spineless, pathetic coward!" Brittany shrieked, her voice shattering into a hysterical pitch that bypassed the microphone entirely and bounced off the crystal chandeliers. Before Jamal could utter another word, Brittany lunged forward. She planted her stilettos firmly into the stage, wound her right arm back, and delivered a devastating open-handed slap directly across Jamal's jaw. The impact was sickeningly loud. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the cavernous ballroom, sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. Jamal's head snapped violently to the side, a bright red handprint instantly blooming across his sweaty, pale cheek. The force sent him stumbling backward, his polished shoes tangling together until he crashed heavily against the mahogany podium. The elite crowd gasped collectively. Several wealthy socialites physically recoiling from the sudden burst of domestic violence unfolding on the brightly lit stage. Nobody intervened. They simply watched the spectacular implosion of the Wilson family with morbid, disgusted curiosity. The slap was the catalyst that ignited a powder keg of resentment and financial desperation. Jamal recovered his balance, his eyes narrowing with a vicious hatred. He lunged back toward Brittany, his hands raised in defensive fury. "You ruined my life!" He roared, his spit flying under the harsh spotlight. "You and your psychotic mother drained my accounts to buy designer dresses while my brokerage bled cash. I am the one who is going to testify against you. I will give the Attorney General everything they need to lock you away for decades." Brittany shrieked like a banshee, batting his hands away and shoving him hard in the chest. "You knew exactly where that money was coming from," she screamed back, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. "You begged me to funnel the charity funds into your accounts so you would not look like a complete failure to your investors. You are nothing without me." Down on the main floor, Diane realized with horrifying clarity that there was absolutely no escape. The auditors had secured the exits, the donors were filming the meltdown, and her daughter was screaming out confessions of federal wire fraud into a live microphone. Her carefully constructed aristocratic empire was dead. She needed an immediate, undeniable distraction to halt the proceedings and escape the room. Diane clutched her chest, letting out a dramatic, wavering gasp. She staggered out from behind the cascading white orchids, her hands fluttering wildly in the air. "My heart," she wailed loudly, attempting to project her voice over the vicious screaming match on the stage above her. "I cannot breathe. The stress is killing me." With a theatrically slow, choreographed movement, Diane collapsed onto the marble floor. She let her emerald green designer gown drape elegantly around her, closing her eyes and throwing one arm limply across her forehead. It was a classic fainting spell executed with Oscar-worthy precision. She lay there waiting for the rush of concerned billionaires to surround her, waiting for someone to shout for help so she could be discreetly wheeled away from the legal devastation. But the rush never came. The wealthy elite of Chicago simply looked down at her motionless body with cold disgust. A prominent pharmaceutical chief executive literally stepped over her prone legs to get a better camera angle of the stage. Not a single donor called for medical assistance. They recognized the performance for exactly what it was. Diane lay on the cold marble, ignored, a fallen queen discarded by the very society she had committed crimes to impress. Over the frantic, echoing sounds of my family tearing each other to pieces, a new noise began to rise in the distance. It started as a faint wail, steadily growing louder as it cut through the cold Chicago night. The unmistakable shriek of approaching police sirens drowned out the ambient noise. Through the dark glass of the hotel windows, brilliant flashes of violent red and piercing blue light began to reflect across the ballroom walls. The authorities had finally arrived outside. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly at my sides, watching the flashing lights illuminate the terrified faces of the crowd, waiting patiently for the heavy mahogany doors to open one final time. The heavy mahogany doors did not just open. They were thrust apart with an authoritative, concussive force that commanded absolute submission from everyone present. The flashing red and blue lights from the street poured directly into the grand ballroom, casting long, erratic shadows across the terrified faces of the Chicago elite. 4 heavily armed, uniformed police officers marched through the grand entrance, their heavy utility belts clinking sharply in the sudden suffocating silence of the room. Leading the tactical formation were 2 plainclothes detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit. They wore practical, unwrinkled trench coats that stood out violently against the sea of designer tuxedos and couture gowns. Their expressions were carved from solid stone, radiating a heavy, no-nonsense professionalism that instantly extinguished the chaotic screaming match still raging on the stage. The wealthy donors, who just moments ago were eagerly filming the spectacular family meltdown on their smartphones, scrambled backward in sheer panic. They pressed their bodies tightly against the linen-draped banquet tables, desperately attempting to clear a wide, unobstructed path for the approaching authorities. The string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing, leaving only the sound of heavy boots hitting the marble floor. The lead detective did not pause to survey the extravagant ice sculptures or the terrified billionaires. He walked straight down the center aisle with predatory, unwavering focus, his eyes locked entirely on his targets. He climbed the stage stairs with heavy, deliberate steps, completely bypassing my position at the podium, as if I were merely a piece of the elaborate set design. I stepped back smoothly, yielding the floor to the federal authorities without uttering a single word. Brittany and Jamal froze instantly, their petty, vicious domestic dispute evaporating into thin air in the face of imminent, catastrophic incarceration. The lead detective stopped squarely in front of my sister, plunging his hand deep inside his trench coat pocket. He withdrew two crisply folded pieces of official paper, holding them up directly into the harsh glare of the overhead spotlight. Brittany Wilson and Jamal Wilson, he announced, his voice booming with absolute authority, requiring absolutely no microphone to be heard in the back of the room. We have federal warrants for your immediate arrest on multiple felony charges, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and operating a fraudulent nonprofit organization. Brittany's mouth opened in silent horror, but only a dry, rattling gasp escaped her restricted throat. The carefully cultivated illusion of her philanthropic grandeur shattered completely into a million irreparable pieces as a uniformed officer stepped forward, roughly grabbing her delicate wrists. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, snapping shut tightly over her diamond tennis bracelets, echoed harshly through the cavernous ballroom. The physical reality of the cold restraints finally broke through her thick layer of denial and shock. She thrashed violently against the officer's unrelenting grip, twisting her body aggressively to glare at me with eyes full of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You set me up!" she screamed, her voice tearing at the seams, spraying panicked saliva under the blinding stage lights. "You planned this entire thing just to destroy me. You are a cold, calculated monster." I looked at her thrashing, pathetic form with absolute, unwavering neutrality. "I did not steal the charitable money, Brittany," I replied, my voice steady, measured, and completely devoid of any familial pity. "I just turned on the lights, so everyone else could see exactly what you were doing in the dark." Beside her, Jamal was not putting up any sort of physical fight. He was completely and utterly disintegrating before our eyes. As the second officer forced his arms behind his back, Jamal sank heavily to his knees, ripping the expensive fabric of his tailored trousers on the hard wooden stage. He began blubbering uncontrollably, thick, shameful tears mixing with the heavy layer of terrified sweat coating his face. "Please, you have to listen to me," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine that made the nearby investors cringe in secondhand embarrassment. "I have all the financial records secured in my private office. I can prove she manipulated the commercial accounts without my consent. I will give you all the ledgers right now. I will testify against her in court, just please do not put me in a holding cell." The lead plainclothes detective simply looked down at the weeping man with a cold expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. He gestured sharply for the uniformed officers to haul the sobbing real estate broker to his feet, ignoring his frantic, pathetic pleas for a desperate plea deal. Down on the main floor, the miraculous healing power of impending federal charges had taken full and immediate effect. Diane, who had been lying perfectly still on the cold marble floor, feigning a lethal cardiac event, suddenly snapped her eyes wide open. Seeing her golden child secured in handcuffs and her son-in-law begging for federal immunity, her maternal instincts completely vanished. They were instantly replaced by sheer, unfiltered, animalistic self-preservation. With remarkable agility for a woman wearing a restrictive emerald green couture gown, she rolled onto her stomach and scrambled quietly toward the heavy velvet curtains, masking the service corridor. She kept incredibly low to the ground, using the distracted, horrified crowd as a human shield, desperately inching her way toward the illuminated red exit sign. She reached the brass handle of the side door, her fingers slick with terrified sweat, genuinely believing she had successfully abandoned her ruined family. Just as she pulled the heavy door open, a tall, imposing figure stepped out from the shadows of the corridor, completely blocking her escape route. Attorney Kensington looked down at her, straightening his perfectly knotted silk tie with glacial, terrifying composure. "Leaving so soon, Diane?" he asked, his voice dripping with polite, lethal menace. The Internal Revenue Service agents waiting in the main hotel lobby would absolutely love to have a word with you about your 5 years of aggressive federal tax evasion. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut for the final time, sealing the fate of the Wilson family empire. The mass exodus of Chicago's high society elite had been a brutal, unchoreographed stampede of self-preservation. Billionaires, venture capitalists, and prominent politicians had scrambled over one another to escape the blast radius of a federal indictment, fleeing the grand ballroom as if the very air had become toxic. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the Chicago street in harsh, unforgiving strokes. I stood at the edge of the polished wooden stage, watching impassively as the final acts of my family's humiliating downfall played out on the wet pavement below. Uniformed officers aggressively guided Brittany toward the back of a squad car. Her custom-beaded couture gown was torn at the hem, dragging through muddy puddles as she fought the officer's iron grip. She screamed obscenities into the cold night air, her face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of rage and absolute denial, before a heavy hand pushed her head down and forced her into the back seat. The door slammed shut, cutting off her hysterical shrieks instantly. Jamal was placed in a separate vehicle parked 50 feet away. He offered no resistance. His broad shoulders were slumped, his expensive tuxedo soaked in nervous sweat, his chin resting on his chest in total pathetic defeat. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a fraud who had finally run out of lies to tell. Moments later, Diane emerged from the hotel lobby. She was flanked by 4 unsmiling federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service. She was not handcuffed, but the firm grip an agent kept on her elbow made it crystal clear that she was not leaving under her own volition. Diane clutched her designer purse tightly against her chest, desperately attempting to hide her face from the few lingering reporters and socialites who were actively filming her disgraceful exit. The matriarch of the family, the woman who had sacrificed her own flesh and blood for social standing, was shoved into an unmarked black sedan and driven away into the dark. The chaotic symphony of wailing sirens eventually faded into the distance, leaving behind an oppressive, echoing silence. The grand ballroom, which had been pulsating with artificial glamour and manufactured prestige just an hour ago, was now a desolate wasteland of discarded luxury. I slowly descended the 3 wooden steps from the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I walked through the center aisle, observing the aftermath of the absolute destruction I had orchestrated. It was a breathtaking portrait of superficiality. Hundreds of half-full crystal champagne flutes were abandoned haphazardly on the imported silk tablecloths, their expensive contents slowly going flat. Delicate porcelain plates holding untouched beluga caviar and prime Wagyu beef sat abandoned at every table. Heavy golden chairs were knocked backward, discarded by cowards desperate to distance themselves from federal wire fraud. I paused near the towering, extravagant ice sculpture at the center of the room. It was already beginning to melt water, dripping steadily onto the floor, ruining the intricate, beautiful design. It was the perfect metaphor for my family. They had sacrificed every ounce of their morality, their integrity, and their actual familial bonds just to purchase a temporary ticket into a world that never truly wanted them. The billionaires and corporate socialites had sipped my mother's champagne and laughed at my sister's jokes, but the exact second the illusion shattered, that entire world rejected them without a single moment of hesitation. They were not friends. They were a transactional audience, and the show had just been forcefully canceled. I stood in the middle of the empty room, flanked only by the silent, imposing presence of my private security detail and the sharp, calculating mind of Attorney Kensington. For the first time in my entire life, the suffocating shadow of my family's narcissistic ambition had been completely eradicated. I was no longer the scapegoat, I was the architect of their ruin. The sharp, crisp sound of a throat clearing broke through the heavy silence of the ballroom. I turned to see Attorney Kensington stepping forward, stepping meticulously over a discarded velvet napkin. He was holding a sleek silver tablet, his eyes scanning the glowing screen with the precise methodical focus of a legal surgeon. He did not look at the ruined ballroom. He only looked at the data. The operational execution was absolutely flawless. Clara Kensington stated, his voice completely devoid of emotional inflection, echoing slightly in the vast, empty space. He tapped the screen twice, bringing up a secure portal. As of 3 minutes ago, the federal banking regulators officially finalized the emergency injunctions. The foreclosure on Jamal's commercial real estate brokerage is now permanent and legally binding. His corporate accounts have been entirely liquidated by the state to cover the immediate penalties. The doors to his firm are currently being padlocked by federal marshals. He paused, looking up from the tablet to meet my gaze directly. Furthermore, the Attorney General has successfully frozen every single asset tied to Brittany's fraudulent charity foundation. The shell corporations have been dismantled. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands are currently being seized and repatriated. By tomorrow morning, those millions of dollars in stolen public donations will be forcefully redistributed to actual verified community mental health clinics operating within the city limits. The money is finally going exactly where it was supposed to go. I absorbed his clinical report, silently processing the monumental scale of my victory. The burning adrenaline that had fueled my actions for the past 20 long hours finally began to evaporate, leaving behind a profound physical exhaustion. I nodded, feeling absolute clarity as the adrenaline permanently fades. I turned to Kensington. We aren't done yet. I want every single property, every asset they bought with stolen money liquidated. And I want to know exactly what happens to them next. 6 months is a surprisingly short amount of time to completely dismantle a human life. But when the very foundation is built entirely on layers of malicious fraud, the resulting collapse always happens with terrifying, unstoppable speed. The bitter freezing. Chicago winter eventually thawed into a damp, unforgivingly gray spring, slowly washing away the absolute last remnants of my family's fabricated, fraudulent empire. The grand, opulent ballroom, where I had meticulously executed their highly public downfall, felt like a lifetime ago, yet the devastating shockwaves of that single chaotic night were still actively leveling their pathetic reality. I sat silently in my dark corner office, overlooking the sprawling city skyline, slowly reviewing the final thick stack of official liquidation reports Kensington had just placed carefully on my mahogany desk. The relentless legal machinery had ground my family into absolute dust, operating with the exact cold, mechanical precision I had explicitly demanded from the very beginning. I deeply wanted to personally witness the permanent totality of their ruin, and the crisp documents resting in my hands beautifully painted a flawless masterpiece of absolute irreversible destruction. We heavily focused our initial brutal financial autopsy entirely on Jamal. He was always the weak link, the eager parasite who had happily attached himself to my family's toxic wealth. Jamal always believed he was the smartest man in the room, a charismatic predator who could charm his way out of any consequence. But federal indictments do not care about expensive tailored suits or practiced smiles. The reality of facing decades in federal prison stripped away Jamal's polished veneer overnight. The moment he and Brittany posted their exorbitant bail, paid for by liquidating the last of Diane's unseized jewelry, the facade of their perfect high society marriage violently disintegrated. Jamal immediately went into a frantic, primitive survival mode. Desperate to distance himself from the radioactive fallout of the charity fraud, he retained a cutthroat defense attorney and filed for a highly publicized, deeply vicious divorce. He dragged Brittany through the mud in the press, officially claiming he was an innocent, trusting husband who had been completely manipulated by a sociopathic wife. He handed over every single text message, every shared email, and every private financial ledger he could find to the state prosecutors, eagerly offering to become a star witness against the Wilson family in exchange for legal immunity. He genuinely believed that throwing Brittany directly into the line of fire would somehow magically cleanse his own hands of the stolen millions resting in his brokerage accounts. But his desperate betrayal did not save him. The Financial Crimes Unit had already traced the serial numbers on every single wire transfer. Jamal was not an innocent bystander. He was a willing active participant who had knowingly weaponized stolen charity funds to artificially inflate his failing business. His pathetic attempt to play the victim only sealed his fate, alienating him from the last few influential contacts he possessed. With his criminal complicity cemented, the full, crushing weight of my company's legal retaliation slammed down onto Jamal's life. Kensington and I did not just freeze his assets, we completely obliterated them. My investment firm formally absorbed all of his outstanding corporate debt, legally granting us total control over his entire real estate brokerage. I took immense quiet satisfaction in systematically dismantling his precious company piece by piece. I authorized the immediate sale of his entire portfolio of luxury commercial properties, intentionally dumping them on the open market for literal pennies on the dollar. We liquidated his entire fleet of leased sports cars, auctioned off his custom office furniture, and emptied his offshore holdings to aggressively pay back the endless line of furious creditors he had scammed. The prestigious brokerage that bore his name was erased from existence, replaced by an empty, dusty storefront with a foreclosure sign taped to the glass. But the financial ruin was only the beginning of his punishment. The State Real Estate Commission, horrified by the sheer scale of his involvement in a federal embezzlement ring, took unprecedented immediate action. They did not just suspend his license, they permanently revoked it. Jamal was banned for life from ever holding a real estate broker's license in any state in the country. The career he had sacrificed his entire moral compass to build was completely vaporized. Yesterday, Kensington sent me a photograph taken by one of our private investigators. It showed Jamal's new reality. The man who used to drink vintage champagne with billionaires was sitting behind a scratched laminate desk inside a dingy, poorly lit budget car rental agency on the outskirts of the city. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting polyester uniform shirt, his face visibly aged and lined with permanent exhaustion. He is currently working as a low-level customer service assistant, enduring the daily abuse of angry tourists arguing over compact sedans. He earns minimum wage, and every single paycheck he receives is immediately garnished by the federal government to pay off the massive court-ordered restitution. He spends his days trapped in a fluorescent nightmare, fully aware that he will never step foot inside a luxury penthouse again. Jamal's pragmatic, unrelenting greed led him to marry into a profoundly toxic family solely for status and wealth. He traded his integrity for a shortcut to the top, fully embracing the parasitic nature of my mother and sister. He thought he was using them to elevate his own name, completely blind to the fact that their corruption would ultimately drag him down into an inescapable abyss. His ambition cost him his marriage, his wealth, his freedom, and his entire professional existence. He is a ghost of a man, condemned to a life of grueling, humiliating mediocrity. But while Jamal's spectacular plunge into poverty was a satisfying appetizer, he was merely collateral damage in my grand design. The true focus of my vengeance had always been the golden child. What happened to Brittany when the spotlight she so desperately craved finally burned her alive? 6 months later, the sterile, windowless courtroom of the federal building offered a jarring contrast to the crystal chandeliers and overflowing champagne flutes of the grand ballroom. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut, muffling the chaotic sounds of downtown Chicago outside. I sat silently in the very last row of the gallery, completely shrouded in the dim shadows cast by the elevated spectator seating. I did not want my presence to be known. I simply wanted to bear witness to the final permanent dismantling of the golden child. At the front of the room, standing awkwardly before the towering bench of the federal judge, was Brittany. The transformation was absolute and unforgiving. She was no longer draped in custom-beaded couture or adorned with flawless, heavy diamonds. Instead, she was engulfed in a stiff standard-issue orange jumpsuit that washed out her pale complexion. Her perfectly manicured nails were chipped and bitten down to the quick. Her blonde hair, usually styled into effortless cascading waves, was tied back in a harsh, messy knot. She looked small, stripped of the manufactured aristocratic armor she had spent her entire life polishing. Her shoulders were hunched, and her hands trembled visibly as they rested on the defense table. The federal prosecutor, a tall, imposing woman with a voice that commanded absolute attention, stood at the podium. She did not waste time with theatrical flourishes. She presented the state's case with brutal, undeniable efficiency. The prosecutor laid out the staggering scope of the charity fraud, displaying massive ledgers on the courtroom monitors. She detailed exactly how Brittany had deliberately siphoned millions of dollars intended for severe psychiatric care, meticulously routing the donations through offshore shell corporations to fund her own lavish lifestyle. The judge stared down at the evidence, his expression hardening with every passing minute. But the financial devastation was merely the foundation of the prosecution's case. The true fatal blow came when the prosecutor transitioned from embezzlement to physical assault. She turned to the monitors and queued up a video file. I watched as the grainy black and white footage from the hospital security camera filled the screens. The entire courtroom collectively held its breath. The silent video showed me lying unconscious in the hospital bed, recovering from the deliberate, near-fatal staircase push. Then Brittany entered the frame. The footage captured her toxic, malicious intent with terrifying clarity. It showed her standing over my motionless body, her face twisted in a vicious sneer. It showed her reaching down with calculated cruelty and violently yanking the intravenous line directly out of my arm. The violent jerk of the needle, the immediate blooming of dark blood on the pristine white sheets, and her satisfied cold smile as she walked away were all broadcast for the federal judge to examine. The prosecutor's voice sliced through the stunned silence of the courtroom. Your Honor, this footage demonstrates a profound sociopathic lack of empathy, she stated firmly, pointing directly at Brittany. The defendant did not just orchestrate a massive financial fraud to steal from the vulnerable. When her own sister threatened to expose her corruption, the defendant resorted to attempted murder, followed by a vicious physical assault on an incapacitated patient. She exhibits no remorse, no moral compass, and represents an active, ongoing danger to society. The prosecution demands the absolute maximum sentencing guidelines be applied. Brittany sank into her chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. The undeniable visual evidence of her own cruelty had completely vaporized whatever flimsy defense her expensive, desperate lawyers had attempted to construct. The judge did not hesitate. He leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses, his voice echoing with absolute unyielding finality. Brittany Wilson, he announced, his gaze piercing through her fragile, broken posture. For the charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and aggravated assault, you are hereby sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. You are also ordered to pay full financial restitution for the stolen charity assets. The heavy strike of the judge's wooden gavel sounded like a tombstone slamming shut. The sharp, decisive crack finalized the destruction of the golden child. Brittany gasped, a dry, rattling sound of pure terror escaping her throat as two armed bailiffs immediately stepped forward to escort her away. She was going to spend the best decades of her life locked inside a concrete cell, entirely stripped of the wealth and status she had sacrificed her own soul to accumulate. Before the bailiffs could grab her arms, Brittany spun around frantically, her wide, panicked eyes searching the gallery. She looked desperately past the reporters and the court sketch artists. She was looking for the one person who had always bailed her out, the person who had orchestrated the stolen college funds, the stolen inheritance, and the lifelong campaign of emotional abuse. She was looking for her mother. She expected Diane to be sitting in the front row, weeping dramatically, screaming at the judge, and promising to fix this catastrophic nightmare. But the front row was completely empty. Brittany's face crumpled into a mask of absolute devastating realization. The mother who had built her into a weapon of pure greed had completely abandoned her the exact second she became a federal liability. She let out a pathetic, broken sob as the bailiffs forced her hands behind her back and marched her toward the holding cells. I remained hidden within the deep shadows of the back row, silently watching the heavy oak door close forever behind my ruined sister. The arrogant sister, who had demanded everything, who had stolen my future and hoarded my inheritance, now possessed nothing but a bleak, miserable cell block. My vengeance against her and her toxic husband was now entirely complete. But as I finally stood up and walked quietly out of the cold, silent courtroom, a final pressing question remained in my mind. Where exactly was the cruel, calculating mother who had meticulously orchestrated it all? Where was the architect of this entire nightmare? While her golden child was being hauled off to a federal cell, Diane Wilson was doing exactly what she had done her entire life. She was prioritizing her own absolute survival at the expense of everyone else around her. The Internal Revenue Service does not negotiate with sentimentality, but they do accept total, unconditional surrender. When the federal agents presented Diane with the irrefutable, crushing evidence of her complicity in Brittany's massive offshore tax evasion and charity embezzlement network, my mother immediately folded. She desperately traded her daughter's freedom for her own, cooperating fully with the state prosecutors and eagerly signing over every single liquid asset she possessed to avoid a prison sentence. She handed the federal government the keys to her Cayman Islands accounts, liquidated her fraudulent stock portfolios, and surrendered the heavy diamond necklaces she had worn like royal armor. It kept her out of a federal penitentiary, but it left her absolutely destitute. The final fatal blow to her manufactured aristocracy came directly from me. The towering, majestic suburban mansion that she had paraded around in for decades, the very house where she had systematically subjected me to 30 long years of psychological torment, had been leveraged with a massive secondary mortgage funded by Jamal's now defunct brokerage. I happily purchased that specific debt during Jamal's liquidation sale, legally transferring the deed to my investment firm. I foreclosed on my mother's precious estate with extreme prejudice, giving her exactly 3 days to vacate the premises before the county sheriff physically padlocked the custom iron gates. The devastating reality of her new existence was a spectacular plunge into the very poverty she had spent her life mocking. There was no grand farewell tour. There were no weeping country club friends offering their lavish guest houses or extending a helping hand. The exact second Diane's bank accounts hit zero, and her name became synonymous with federal wire fraud, her entire network of superficial socialite companions completely vanished into thin air. I hired a private investigator to monitor her transition, purely to ensure the eviction was executed properly. The photographs he sent me painted a breathtaking portrait of karmic justice. Diane Wilson, the woman who used to exclusively drink imported champagne and dictate strict social hierarchies, was captured carrying a cheap, taped-together cardboard box up 3 flights of cracked concrete stairs. Her destination was a tiny, rundown one-bedroom apartment located deep within a notoriously dangerous, neglected neighborhood on the far south side of the city. The exterior brick wall was covered in faded graffiti, and the narrow hallway smelled of damp rot and despair. She had no movers, no assistants, and no luxury vehicles. She wore a faded, out-of-season tracksuit, her once immaculate hair graying at the roots and hanging limply around her exhausted face. Her entire worldly existence had been reduced to whatever she could carry in her own 2 hands. She is now surviving solely on basic minimum social security checks, forced to carefully count her pennies just to afford canned soup and instant coffee at the local discount grocery store. The grand matriarch, who had demanded nothing but the absolute finest things in life, was finally experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world she had always thought she was far too important to inhabit. Inside that miserable, cramped apartment, the crushing weight of her isolation finally broke her. The investigator's report detailed how she spent her days staring blankly at peeling floral wallpaper, trapped in a suffocating silence. Last night, that silence was broken by the harsh buzz of my private office phone. She was sitting on a heavily stained second-hand mattress, surrounded by unpacked trash bags, clutching a cheap plastic prepaid cell phone she had bought from a corner bodega. She dialed my unlisted number, a number she had only managed to acquire by desperately harassing my company's public reception desk for weeks. I let the call go straight to a secure voicemail server, watching the audio file materialize on my pristine computer monitor. When I pressed play, her voice echoed through my spacious office. It was a pathetic, trembling sound, stripped of all its former arrogant authority. "Clara, sweetie, it is. Mom." She wept, her breath hitching with manufactured, theatrical despair. "I have nothing left. The apartment is freezing, and I cannot afford my electric bill this month. Please, Clara. I am your mother. I brought you into this world. I know we had our differences, but surely you can find it in your heart to help me. Just a small monthly allowance, just enough to get me into a safer building. I love you, Clara. I always loved you. Please call me back." The recording ended with a pathetic, lingering sob before the line finally went dead. I sat motionless behind my sprawling mahogany desk, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury penthouse office, at the glittering, vibrant city skyline below. I listened to the entire voicemail a second time, carefully analyzing my own internal reaction. For 30 years, the mere sound of my mother's voice would trigger a massive, overwhelming tidal wave of crippling anxiety, deep resentment, and burning anger. I had spent my entire existence desperately craving her validation, completely terrified of her vicious, calculated cruelty. But as her pathetic, begging sobs filled the quiet air of my executive suite tonight, I felt absolutely nothing. The burning rage that had fueled my meticulous, flawless campaign of absolute destruction had completely evaporated. I did not feel any lingering anger, nor did I feel a single ounce of sympathy. I only felt a cold, pristine, and incredibly clinical indifference. She was no longer a towering, terrifying monster who controlled my destiny. She was just a sad, broken stranger reaping the exact harvest she had spent decades sowing. I reached forward, tapped the screen of my phone twice, and permanently blocked the cheap prepaid number forever. The screen of my sleek smartphone faded to a permanent black, swallowing my mother's pathetic manufactured sobs into the digital void. I placed the device face down on my desk, savoring the pristine silence that instantly filled my executive suite. I stood up, the sharp click of my heels echoing against the imported marble floor, and walked toward the towering floor-to-ceiling glass walls enclosing my penthouse office. Outside, the sprawling Chicago skyline put on a spectacular evening performance. The setting sun painted the skyscrapers in fiery strokes of crushed gold and vibrant crimson. It was a breathtaking view commanding the pinnacle of the city's corporate ecosystem. As I looked out over the metropolis, I marveled at the staggering contrast to my reality just 1 year ago. Back then, my entire world had been confined to the sterile beige walls of a hospital recovery room. I had been broken, breathing through the agonizing pain of fractured ribs while listening to my family's unified betrayal. They had stood over my incapacitated body and assumed I was permanently defeated, drastically underestimating the calculating architect hiding beneath the surface. My physical wounds had completely healed months ago, leaving behind only invisible scars, but the emotional armor I forged in that cold hospital bed was now impenetrable. I had systematically dismantled the parasitic empire of the Wilson family, erasing their fraudulent legacy, and erected a titanium fortress of my own design. I was no longer the discarded middle child. I was the sole proprietor of a billion-dollar medical technology firm, controlling my destiny with absolute authority. The quiet hum of the glass door sliding open broke my reverie. I turned from the blazing sunset to see Brenda stepping into my office. The visual transformation of the woman before me was extraordinary. Gone were the faded blue scrubs she wore during those grueling night shifts in the intensive care unit. Today, Brenda was impeccably dressed in a sharp charcoal power suit, her posture radiating an undeniable authority that perfectly matched her new environment. When I finalized the hostile takeover and launched the philanthropic arm of my medical AI firm, my first executive action was tracking her down. I did not want a board filled with out-of-touch corporate socialites looking for a tax write-off. I wanted someone who understood the raw reality of patient suffering. I wanted the exact woman who fearlessly stood up to my father's intimidation tactics, the nurse who secured the stairwell footage and protected me when I was defenseless. I recruited her, offering a salary that made her gasp, and appointed her as the Chief Director of Community Health and Patient Advocacy. She was the moral compass of my new empire, a fiercely loyal ally who proved her unwavering integrity when it mattered most. Brenda walked across the room completely unfazed by the luxury of the penthouse and offered me a genuine smile. "We are officially live, Clara," Brenda announced, her voice vibrating with profound satisfaction. She handed me a sleek tablet, gesturing toward the glowing datasets populating the screen. I looked down, scanning the meticulously organized financial spreadsheets and operational heat maps. This was the ultimate culmination of my entire revenge strategy. The millions of dollars Attorney Kensington clawed back from Brittany's dismantled shell corporations and offshore accounts were no longer sitting dormant in government trusts. Through Brenda's relentless advocacy and my company's algorithmic routing systems, we successfully redirected every stolen penny back into the exact communities my sister had callously exploited. The tablet displayed live feeds from 4 newly constructed state-of-the-art community psychiatric clinics located in the city's most historically neglected districts. I watched the crisp video streams showing brightly lit reception areas and dedicated medical professionals actively treating patients who had previously been entirely ignored by the system. We were not throwing lavish self-congratulatory charity galas in opulent hotel ballrooms. We were executing the quiet, incredibly vital business of actual healing. This was real, tangible impact, untainted by the narcissistic greed that defined my mother and sister's entire existence. Brenda tapped a metric on the screen, highlighting a rapidly growing patient intake number. "We have fully staffed the new facilities, and the AI diagnostic tools are already reducing patient wait times by over 40%, she explained. "We are genuinely changing lives out there, Clara. The money is finally doing exactly what it was always supposed to do." I absorbed the incredible data, feeling a profound sense of peace settle into my bones. The dark shadow of the Wilson family had not just been eradicated, it had been forcefully transformed into a powerful engine for undeniable good. I swiped the tablet screen, bringing up the final pending authorization document of the day. It was a massive architectural proposal and funding contract for a brand new pediatric oncology wing at the very same hospital where my family had once tried to silence me. I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed my finger against the digital glass, executing my signature with a swift, decisive stroke, instantly releasing $50 million to fully fund the entire construction. I handed the sleek tablet back to Brenda, offering her a nod of absolute mutual respect. She understood exactly what this moment meant, recognizing the monumental shift from victimhood to sovereignty. I turned back toward the glass windows, watching the final sliver of the sun dip below the jagged concrete horizon of the city. I had taken the agonizing pain of my past, the years of severe emotional starvation, and the violent, near-fatal physical betrayal, and I had successfully weaponized it. I had forged an unstoppable empire of healing, completely insulated by untouchable wealth and guarded by impenetrable loyalty. My family was currently rotting away in federal prison cells and decaying apartments entirely consumed by their own miserable self-inflicted destruction. I, however, stood at the absolute zenith of the world, staring out over a glittering kingdom that I had built with my own 2 hands, permanently untouchable, undeniably powerful, and blissfully free. Brenda offered a final, knowing smile before quietly turning and exiting the vast executive suite, the heavy glass door sealing shut with a soft, definitive click. I was completely alone in the penthouse, enveloped in a profound, immaculate silence that felt heavier and more valuable than any currency. I stepped slowly toward the towering floor-to-ceiling window, resting my fingertips against the cool, thick glass. Outside, the sprawling Chicago skyline was transitioning from the fiery hues of sunset into the deep electric brilliance of a sprawling urban night. Millions of glowing lights flickered to life across the grid, representing countless overlapping lives, ambitions, and secrets. Somewhere down there in that sprawling labyrinth of concrete and steel, Jamal was likely ending a truly grueling shift of menial labor. Somewhere far out in the neglected periphery, Diane was shivering in a dilapidated, unheated apartment, entirely forgotten by the high society world she had worshipped. And miles away in a federal penitentiary, Brittany was staring at the cinder-block walls of a locked cell, permanently stripped of her stolen glamour. I stood hundreds of feet above them, all entirely untouched by the devastating wreckage they had brought upon themselves. The contrast between my current reality and the terrifying vulnerability of my past was staggering. My mind involuntarily drifted back to the sterile, suffocating atmosphere of that hospital room. I could still vividly recall the harsh sting of the antiseptic, the rhythmic mocking beep of the heart monitor, and the sheer blinding terror of lying incapacitated while my own blood relatives actively plotted my demise. They had looked down at my broken body and seen nothing but a convenient obstacle to be removed, a scapegoat whose pain was entirely irrelevant to their narcissistic ambitions. For 30 years, they had systematically conditioned me to believe that my only purpose was to absorb their cruelty, to act as the dark, silent background against which their manufactured brilliance could shine. I had spent decades desperately trying to earn their approval, twisting myself into agonizing shapes just to secure a single drop of genuine maternal affection or sisterly loyalty. Sitting in that hospital bed, watching the very people who were supposed to protect me casually weaponize my near-fatal injuries. The devastating truth had finally shattered my lifelong illusion. The trauma of that ultimate betrayal could have easily destroyed me. It could have turned me into a bitter, hollow shell. Instead, I chose to meticulously forge that agonizing pain into an instrument of absolute uncompromising power. Society continuously tells women that we must endure toxic family dynamics because blood is thicker than water. We are relentlessly programmed from birth to keep the peace, to accept the scraps thrown our way, and to be the willing scapegoat so the golden children can comfortably shine. We are burdened with the immense, unfair responsibility of maintaining the fragile facade of family unity, constantly ordered to forgive the unforgivable simply because the perpetrators happen to share our genetic code. We are told that cutting ties is selfish, that holding our abusers accountable is an act of unnatural cruelty. But that is a catastrophic manipulative lie designed solely to protect the abusers. Blood does not make a family. Shared genetics do not automatically grant a lifelong license to inflict psychological warfare and financial devastation without facing severe consequences. Respect, unyielding loyalty, and basic human decency make a family. Brenda, a woman who possessed absolutely no biological connection to me, had demonstrated infinitely more familial loyalty in a single night than my mother had in 3 entire decades. True family is not determined by a birth certificate. It is determined by who actively chooses to stand beside you when the absolute worst moments of your life threaten to pull you under. My mother and sister honestly thought they could bleed me dry and seamlessly discard me. They looked at my quiet demeanor, my relentless work ethic, and my persistent refusal to engage in their dramatic superficial games, and they fundamentally miscalculated. They thought my silence was weakness. They mistook my strategic patience for submission. They truly believed that because I did not scream and demand attention like a petulant child, I was somehow incapable of fighting back. They didn't realize that while they were busy building a fragile, precarious house of cards out of stolen charity funds, fraudulent shell companies, and pathological lies, I was quietly laying the unshakable foundation for an impenetrable fortress. They spent their entire lives chasing the shallow, fleeting illusion of power, wearing borrowed diamonds, and sipping stolen champagne, while I focused intensely on acquiring absolute undeniable leverage. I built my vast wealth in the shadows, entirely free from their toxic interference, securing a level of financial and legal dominance they could not even begin to comprehend. By the time they finally realized I was no longer their compliant victim, the steel trap had already snapped shut around their ankles. Their ruin was not an accident. It was the mathematical certainty of their own profound arrogance colliding with my meticulous preparation. The vibrant city lights reflected in the glass, casting a soft, victorious glow across my face as I took one final look at the empire I had built. I slowly turned away from the window, walking back toward my expansive desk as the automated lights in the executive suite began to dim, bathing the room in a quiet, deeply satisfying darkness. I had completely rewritten my destiny, permanently erasing the pathetic victim they had tried to create. The screen slowly fades to pitch black, leaving only the steady, confident, and unwavering sound of my voice echoing in the absolute void. Never ever let anyone, especially family, convince you that you are worthless. Build your empire in the dark, and when they try to turn out your lights, blind them with your success. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to save yourself? Drop your story in the comments below, and please do not forget to subscribe.